Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughn Manor. So today, we're going to be talking about comic books because this is my Comic Book Wednesday. This is the world's finest team-up. The world's finest team-up of myself and Steve Donoghue, where we'll each talk about a certain comic book subject, in this case, DC Comics. This week, we're talking about our histories with DC Comics. My history, how I got into DC Comics, and he'll talk about how he got into DC Comics. I imagine that they are very different. We came to DC Comics at different times and in different ways, I'm sure. So it'll be interesting to hear what Steve has to say. But this week we're talking DC. We've been talking about Marvel for a long time, so we're switching over for a little while to talk about DC, and then we'll inevitably switch back to Marvel. But there's some DC, there's a lot of things to talk about with DC Comics. And so to start off, just going to talk about how I got into DC Comics and became interested in DC Comics and started reading an awful lot of DC Comics. I was more of a Marvel kid when I was younger. When I was starting to read comics in the 70s, the late 70s and the early 80s, when I was just a little kid, and then a teenager, Marvel Comics just seemed better to me. I knew of DC Comics, of course, and I read DC Comics, but not as much. I really liked Superman. Superman has always been my favorite superhero. But I knew Superman more from the television show The Adventures of Superman, which I used to watch all the time when I was a little kid. TV was always rerunning The Adventures of Superman with George Reeves. And then when the film came out in the late 70s, starring Christopher Reeve, that first Superman movie left a great impression on me. I loved that version of Superman, his version of Superman, at least in the first couple movies. Kind of lost me after that, but the first couple movies were excellent fun with Christopher Reeve, and I think he nailed that character. And so that's how I knew Superman. That, and of course all the cartoons. I liked Batman quite a bit as a character, and I used to read Batman comics here and there. But I didn't get really into DC with a few exceptions. Those few exceptions would be mostly the non-superhero stuff that DC put out that I found really interesting. A couple of note, there was Sergeant Rock. I thought Sergeant Rock was great. All of DC Comics war comics were amazing. They were just fantastic comic books they were adventurous, but they had a very anti-war stance, which was interesting. It was basically telling all of us little kids just how much war sucked and how terrible it was. And yet the adventures were fantastic of these characters. And Sergeant Rock was a really interesting character. So that was my number one war comic. There were others from DC that DC put out. The Unknown Soldier was a good one. Enemy Ace was a good one. They put out really good, really interesting comics. And because DC's reprint program is ridiculous, particularly when you compare it to Marvel, they haven't re-released in a good format recently any of the Sergeant Rock comics. So what they need is a Sergeant Rock omnibus or some kind of big trade paperback of Sergeant Rock. That's what they need, but they haven't done it. So that was one of them. The other one was this character right here, which I loved a lot. This is Jonah Hex. Jonah Hex, the greatest Western comic book of all time, were these old Jonah Hex comic books. This is the big deluxe edition of the Weird Western Tales issues that Jonah Hex was in. And that's just a creepy looking character. And these Western stories were inspired in a large part by the kind of spaghetti Western movies that were out, that Clint Eastwood and some others did. And the artwork is tended to be really, really great in Jonah Hex. So another non superhero comic that I read. And the other one would be, well, there was House of Secrets and House of Mystery. Those I read. And Swamp Thing was a comic book I liked an awful lot, even before the 80s. I liked Swamp Thing. But otherwise, it was all Marvel all the time. I was getting issue after issue of Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four, which was my favorite. And so many Marvel comics. I didn't really have room for a lot of other comics. I had a limited budget when I was a little kid. But I got into DC Comics when they had a big event. It was right around this time, around 86, when this big event happened. This is Crisis on Infinite Earths. And this was huge in comic books at that time. And it kind of got everybody's attention, Crisis on Infinite Earths. DC Comics, they were putting out some good comics before this. But with this series, they decided to revamp and restart their universe. They figured a lot of the old comics were kind of old-fashioned. So they did that. Around the same time, these comics were coming out. This is Batman, The Dark Knight Returns. I did a series of videos on these. This is the very issue that I bought back in 86. And this was a very mature and different version of Batman. I started off really loving it, the first couple issues of this, and then it lost me when Superman showed up and he didn't act like Superman at all. But this was a game changer as far as comic books and DC Comics in particular were concerned. And then they did something that really caught my attention for some reason, because it was on a superhero that I liked an awful lot. And that's when John Byrne from Marvel, who I knew from Marvel, went to DC and did this, The Man of Steel. He did a limited series, and then he took over Superman, and Superman just was completely restarted, which was unheard of at the time to do something like that. Now, they do it all the time. But back then, this was a pretty big deal, The Man of Steel, and how he just completely wiped out a ton of this character's history, which at the time I didn't know about, and just restarted it. And the artwork was really cool. And I think that John Byrne, as far as the character of Superman is concerned, he's got a really good feel for who this character is. His writing is not always the best. I think his writing tends to leave something to be desired. But when you're a kid, it's great. And even better than John Byrne, for me, was an artist named Jerry Ordway. Took over a magazine called The Adventures of Superman. It was they just renumbered Superman, the original Superman series, and so they came out with the Superman #1. And they just kept on going with the older Superman series, which they renamed Adventures of Superman, and that's the one Jerry Ordway did. And he just does some great art. And I got to really become a big fan of Jerry Ordway. I think he is just a fantastic artist. And I came to like his Superman more than I liked John Byrne's Superman. He just did some great stuff, and Marv Wolfman did the writing on that series. And that's reprinted in this Man of Steel hardback series that's just come out. But that was a game changer for me because I liked Superman a lot, but some of the Superman comics books I read were just, they were just okay. So I jumped on board when Byrne took over Superman, and I really, really liked it. Now, at the time, I wasn't aware of the controversial stuff that Crisis and this whole revamping was doing, and that they jettisoned just so much of the character's history, which alienated a lot of the fans of DC Comics at the time. So Superman was restarted and revamped. He was a lot more like the movie Superman in that he was never Superboy. In the old DC continuity, Superman was Superboy first and then became Superman. Although, in the very first version of Superman by Siegel and Schuster, that was not the case. So that was kind of a revamp anyway, Superboy. Although popular one. And it was actually, there were some good Superboy stories. But I didn't know about that so much at the time I was reading these. I didn't know Superman's extensive history. I thought Superboy was stupid anyway, because, you know, I was 15 and I thought anything like that was dumb. And so I thought it was cool that they got rid of Superboy. I wasn't a big fan of Supergirl either, so, you know, I was fine with her dying in Crisis. I got to really like those characters later as I got older and actually tracked down some of the older Superman stuff. It's as I became older, through my 20s and 30s, as I kind of diligently hunted down all the older Superman stories and collections and whatever I could find of older Superman stuff, that I realized the kind of history he had. And that all of the DC Comics characters had this kind of history. So I can understand now, looking back, how alienating it must have been to older fans that DC Comics did that. But they did that for a solid reason, and that reason is that their comics weren't selling that well compared to Marvel. They had to Marvelize their line and make their comics seem more like Marvel comics. And they just had so much baggage and history kind of holding them down. I think they felt that they wanted a free hand. And they wanted this event to be able to attract new readers to their comics. And it worked. I mean, it worked on me. That's how it got me on board. So, you know, I have to say, Crisis, Man of Steel, it worked, that whole revamp. Because not only did I start reading Superman and Batman again, and Batman became really good soon after that. Especially when Norm Brafogel got on DC's Detective Comics. But I became a big fan of The Flash. The Flash has since become one of my favorite DC Comics superheroes. I love The Flash. You know, for a character that doesn't do much other than go fast, they've always done a really great job with this character. This character, unlike a lot of characters, you could pretty much pick up his comic at any time in his history and it was probably going to be pretty good. Right after Crisis, the original Flash, Barry Allen, died. And Kid Flash, Wally West, took over. And that's when I started reading it. So I started reading Wally West stuff before I read the original stuff. The artwork was not spectacular on The Flash, but the writing was good and the stories were interesting. I remember that. And so I stuck with The Flash all this time. And he's always been good, I have to say. That is one consistent comic book. I started reading a bunch of other stuff that I didn't know anything about, Green Lantern, all the other DC Comics superheroes. I got really interested in DC. And so I've kind of been following along with DC ever since that event and going back to the earlier stuff. So I didn't find the Silver Age stuff until later, with a couple of exceptions. But mostly I caught up with DC around that time and later, and that's when Swamp Thing was getting really good, right in the 80s. Alan Moore took over Swamp Thing, and that became a revolutionary book. Which surprised me because I was already a Swamp Thing fan. So I was pretty happy about that. It was an exciting time for comics when I got into DC Comics. Now, DC Comics has kind of gone up and down quality-wise over the years. Marvel has as well. I think actually Marvel might have suffered more than DC as far as quality. But that could just be me. Both companies have this problem where, because Crisis was so darn successful for DC Comics and Secret Wars was so successful for Marvel, that one of the things they do to get people to read their comics is they have these big, gigantic crossovers that kind of just barge into every issue of everything. And they'll have one of those a year, and have, I think, since Crisis. And those are annoying. I think those annoy all comics fans at this point. And then Marvel and DC have both started doing this thing where they'll kill off characters for no reason, just for sales. Yeah, they'll kill them off or make them disappear or replace them with newer versions of themselves. They keep doing that. The problem is with DC Comics and Marvel Comics is that the single issues, the floppy issues, the sales on those have been going down for a long time. The sales are not good for DC Comics right now. It's just a format, you know, if you're selling your individual comic books for like $5, I don't know what you expect. Your sales are going to go down. I mean, who's going to buy a ton of comic books at $5 a pop? I guess some people do. It seems like an expensive habit. I had to give it up, buying monthly comics. I became one of those people that just buy the trade reprint, or I'll get them digitally. I don't keep up the way I used to. Too many events, too many replacements of characters, too many gimmicks, that kind of stuff. Although there's been some good stuff over the years, which we're going to talk about, Steve and I. We'll be talking about things, I think, like the New 52 and some other things that have been going on. Surely we'll talk about bisexual Superman. Superman's son came out as bisexual recently, which is fine. But the way that DC did it is they made it seem like they did it. Here's the thing with that. And here's the problem I have with this kind of thing from DC Comics and Marvel Comics and comic books in general. Is I think sales have just become so bad in comic books now that they need headlines now and then to sell comics. So they'll have some big event or they'll kill a character off, but that doesn't work so well anymore because they're always killing characters off and bringing them back. Or revamping their universes until continuity is just incredibly confusing. And they did this thing with Superman where his son, the newer version of Superman, came out as bisexual so that all of the news outlets at once would put out these stories, Superman comes out as bisexual, just to sell the comics and boost their sales for just 1 or 2 issues. And the thing that's annoying to me about that is, you know, DC Comics doesn't care about gay people, it doesn't care about bisexual people, doesn't care about the whole LGBT community at all, really. It just wants to sell comic books, so they're using that community to sell comic books. And that's the thing that bugs about it. It just seems, something about that just doesn't seem right. I mean, I don't care that Superman's son is bisexual. I mean, who cares? But it's just the way that it was done seemed, I don't know. It was just a headline to sell comics, and that's the kind of thing that they do now. Which puts me off some of the newer stuff. That's one of the reasons I don't keep up like I used to. But that kind of thing. But we'll talk about that, I'm sure, Steve Donoghue and I. It'll be interesting to hear his history with DC Comics, because I know he started at a different time and in a different place and with different comics than I did. I basically started with DC with Crisis. Before that, you know, it was all Marvel all the time. But I'm glad I did start there, because Superman has become my favorite superhero. I like Superman for a lot of the reasons that a lot of people don't like Superman. The fact that he's a really, really good guy, and the fact that he's, you know, that kind of character. He's not a dark character at all. He's a very positive character. The Big Blue Boy Scout, he is called. And I like that about Superman. That's, I think, his strength. But I'll go into Superman later on at another time too. So I've gone on long enough about my history with DC Comics. Next week, Steve and I will talk about something else. I don't know what we're talking about yet next week, but it'll be something DC Comics related. So I hope you enjoyed this. I will catch you next time here at Stately Fawn Manor.